All right. Just think, he wasn't even conceived when we started. All right, this is the last class after 10 years of working at it. And since the last class, instead of doing ordinary synthesis, I just want to have some fun. And we'll work with Hermann Hesse, who was a Nobel Prize-winning author. And the thing we want to look at is that it has been written that to some extent all writing is autobiographical. Even nonfiction has elements of autobiography in it, because what you're writing is an expression of yourself. In fact, I've even judged, using the Carl Jung methods for word association, I have even judged short stories by people just on the vocabulary that they use and the grammatic forms that they use, and surprisingly I could say things about them, about their personalities from vocabulary alone. All right, so what I would like to do is explore some of his books and characters in the books relative to his horoscope. And it's going to be a very superficial exploration because the topic is very large, and my memory is not that good. And there was not time to do an extensive review, and several of my Hermann Hesse books are missing. I only had about 5 of them. At one time I went through a period where I was reading everything by Hermann Hesse. We obviously want to study the most major characters because that is where the most work was done, and that's most likely to be representative of him. Now, in writing, usually the major characters are heroes and heroines. And heroes, or heroines, but more heroes, are ruled by Mars and the Sun. In the Hesse horoscope, Mars and the Sun form a very strong trine. So from this we would expect to find sanguine heroes. But we do not find sanguine heroes. And the reason is that Mars and the Sun are in water signs. So his heroes are more mellow. In fact, they are in Pisces and Cancer, which are the 2 most meek and mild water signs. So the feats of bravery of his heroes are in the emotional sphere. For example, if you take the protagonist in Demian, what he does is he finds courage to finally seek out a partner. It happens to be his friend's mother, but which you'd expect with a Cancer. But he can't actually go out and do this because at this point the war breaks out, and that's the end of the novel. Now, Siddhartha is probably his most pronounced hero. And Siddhartha is a mystic seeker. And Siddhartha, in a lot of the images of him, it's all about water and reflections in the water and the fish under the water and all of that. So we can see that this is pretty much a autobiographical view of the way he sees a hero. Harry Haller is the hero of Steppenwolf, and he's an anti-hero, sort of an anti-hero. He doesn't do any really heroic or anti-heroic things except break through his own limitations and social barriers. In Narcissus and Goldman, there are and there aren't heroic deeds, but both Narcissus and Goldman do aspire spiritually, and they are creative. Now, Aries is the sign of heroism, and it is a fire sign. And fire signs are spirited and proud and assertive and initiating and all of those things. Cancer, the sun sign, is a water sign. And Mars is in Pisces, which is another water signs, and those are pretty gentle signs, neither of them that you are often found with brutish kinds of people. So his concept of a hero is different from the cosmic standard. Analogously, the first house is the house of heroism, and it has to do with brave deeds, outward deeds. For Hess, the sun is in the 7th house, and Mars is in the 3rd house. And from this we can see that his deeds of heroism are involved with interhuman interactions. He's concerned about being able to make progress socially. So bravery is a matter of learning to become emotionally direct without being forceful or overpowering or anything like that. Now the combination is very interesting because the Mars trine the Sun is strong, but neither of the two planets are strong. This suggests that the heroes are not strong, dominant figures, though they do take heroic actions, and they are, again, social actions or things of that nature, and that fits exactly. It describes the heroes of his stories. So this is the impression that you get out of his novels. Now, the Sun and Mars are planets which most indicate masculinity, while the Moon and Venus most indicate femininity. Mars and the Moon are also in a pretty strong trine, and they too are in water signs. Both Venus and the Moon...
You mean Venus and the Moon, not Mars and the Moon?
Yeah, Venus and the Moon, yeah. Both of them are stronger than either Mars or the Sun. So this is sort of a mystery to me. He was not a sexist. He was not a feminist. He was not a male chauvinist. In all of the works which I've read, and I've read quite a few of them, there is not a heroine. There is not a strong feminine figure. He has benign prostitutes and dutiful spouses who are strong in themselves, but none of them is given a major role. All of them are healing to the lead male characters, but none of them is strong in herself. I have no answer for this at all. I don't understand it either astrologically or from his life, so I can only put forth tentative speculations, which I love to do anyway. Perhaps he believed, speculating, in a non-dogmatic way, that this is what was appropriate for women. He believed in the equality of the sexes, and he knew what a strong woman was. He knew of his own need to have women in his life and to have a very strong feminine partner, but he may have believed that women were most effective when they were being responsive, or when they were being indirect and working in an indirect fashion. Another possibility is that he was secure in his feminine nature, which he was, and he did not need to expatiate a lot on it. So there's no indication that he ever acted emotionally ungraceful, and or that he was not responsive in his own nature. Now, some of his characters show a need for women, but they are usually satisfied without them, one way or another. Whether it is in a feminine relationship or not. Perhaps the moon trine Venus indicates that he was content and he was satisfied with those things. Now, the thing about the moon and Venus is that they are both imaginative planets, and they indicate his superb imagination, which is a big part of his success as a writer. Pictures and images are wholes, and they are not something that are easily verbalized. He did a very excellent job not only of conveying pictures in words, but conveying the impression of pictures in words in how one goes about describing them. And that does seem to fit. Now, in theory, it sounds good, but if we look back at the Van Gogh chart, in that chart, Venus was square to the moon, and it indicated an internal struggle between the total image and the emotions that are conveyed in the image. Moreover, Van Gogh had the sun in Aries, and Mars and a bunch of other planets were in the square between Sagittarius and Pisces. So Van Gogh, in the right hemisphere of his brain, describes the peace he had when he was doing imaginative work, and makes that clear or communicates that. Hess puts everything into words, and he doesn't describe that peace that there is with the trine between Venus and the moon. No, there are no dominant, prominent feminine figures in his writings. Relations or non-relations of his masculine figures with women were not always smooth, and it was not because of the women. His masculine figures had difficulty coming out to women. They didn't know how to open themselves emotionally. So since we're speculating wildly, let's do that with another facet of his character and of his writings. Jupiter is very strong. It's the strongest planet, and it's the clear ruler of the ascendant and of the whole horoscope. Sagittarius is on the cusp, and it's on the cusp of the 12th house, the ascendant and the 12th house both. Now usually, not always, but usually this is an indicator of a carryover from the rebirth immediately preceding this one. So let's speculate on a classical 12th house previous life, say that of a monk or of a nun or something like that. Now Jupiter has a strong square with the moon, and it forms a T-square with Mercury, Jupiter's opposite Mercury, which is also square the moon. Now this pattern describes a complex of troublesome behavior problems that some of his characters had. First, there is the character of the celibate male not interested in women. That is the character of Narcissus in Narcissus and Goldman, and of Magister Ludi in the book by the same name. Now, when Narcissus and Goldman was written, Hess was studying and being analyzed by Carl Jung. And at that time, Jung had only two personality types. And he did develop a much more elaborate set of developing types much later on in life. The two types of characters were represented in Narcissus and Goldman. They were archetypes more than they were real people. They were also two halves of every human. Goldman represented the emotional extrovert, which was the one type that Jung found, and Narcissus represented the mental introvert. Now, when we look at Magister Ludi, the other celibate priest type, the pure Sagittarian idealist that doesn't get involved with women, Magister Ludi was written to scold the German intelligentsia for being spineless and for being ivory tower and for not standing up to the Nazis and Hitler. Nonetheless, both Narcissus and Magister Ludi were real characters, and they both had moral and philosophical purity and admirable lives. Both were incomplete to some extent. Now, whether Hess was a monastic in the immediate preceding life or not, he had the qualities of a cleric, of a scholar, of a priest, of a monk. He was even born into a family of of Christian missionaries that went to India. And that was a large part of his character. And for the most part, it was something that was benign. He read, he studied, and he lived an intellectual life of a scholar. He was ivory tower himself, and he could easily be removed. But he wasn't happy with it. The clerical things and the scholarly things are indicated by Jupiter and by Sagittarius. His ambivalence and his hesitancy and his dislike of pedantry and his activity mentally are all indicated by the Jupiter opposite Mercury. Narcissus and Magister Ludi, neither one of them seek a woman. But the other half of Narcissus does. That is Goldman. And so do almost all of his male leads. All of his male leads see a need for real emotions and for emotional release in art, in society, and certainly in women. All of his other heroes appeal to women, sometimes prostitutes, in order to have emotional release and not be cooped up in themselves. And they all start with the beginning of a healing or a beginning of moving toward wholeness. And this is perfectly biographical, autobiographical of Hess. He needed a woman, but he still was removed like a scholar or something of that nature. So the release, because held back by the scholarly nature, by the clerical nature, was always intense. It even went as far as debauchery, at least in his characters. And I think in that regard, I think he was living out dreams or desires through his characters, but he wasn't that way himself. Now, in some cases, this is a healing, but it introduces problems of its own. There's a tendency to solve these problems by reverting back to the priestly mind. But that priestly mind has always proven to be insufficient and ineffective for solving the problem. So, a clear solution to his dilemma of being divided in between himself, between the emotional nature and the intellectual nature, are never given. There is no solution. It's hinted at. There are hints that creativity and new ways of thinking are the basis of it. And these tentative solutions are shown in Uranus. Uranus is trine to Jupiter, and it forms a very strong sextile with Mercury. But they're all hidden. So it's a problem-solving kind of Uranus, and it resolves the differences between the idealist and between the pedantic scholar, and it offers a different channel for the creative energy or the emotional output without it having to be in debauch. A large part of this is indicated in his book called The Journey to the East. But because he can't live it out himself, he actually calls himself out in the novel. And he shames himself for not being true to the ideal of aspiring to purity and a higher life of enlightenment and things of that nature. Now, it's ironic, but this takes us right back to the priestly purity again. But it's not in orthodoxy. It's not a written down that purity is this and this and this. So he has rejected one kind of purity, and he finds salvation in a different kind of purity, which is in creation. So you might say for him that Uranus is his liberator, but it is a matter of how far he can give himself to the spiritual things to really be liberated. Uranus is the creator, and it indicates that he did liberate himself through his works, and he did resolve major differences through himself. But how far he got, he certainly wasn't content. But how many people are content with how much they grow spiritually? All right, now let's look at Elizabeth Taylor for a little bit. Again, I didn't synthesize a whole lot. I just went for something. I went for something that was interesting for me. After 10 years, I figured, well, I'll just be indulgent, as if I'm not indulgent in all of these classes anyway. Throughout history, society has had a social schizophrenia about actors and actresses. On one hand, they have been looked on as being almost divine beings. And on the other hand, they have been looked at as unreliable, untouchable trash. And Elizabeth Taylor has been seen both ways. And what I'd like to look at for just a few minutes, we will be out of here in less than an hour tonight, is I would like to look in a synthetic way at various dangers of vicarious living. Now, in the written brief, some of the things are shown of why this horoscope is so excellent for acting. The fifth house is the house for acting, and acting in such a way that one puts oneself into the role and brings it to life while giving the role character. The 11th house is the house for acting, wherein one sets oneself aside and as much as possible lives in the role. And it then becomes an impersonal, universal role with a definition that is beyond the personal individual in that role. Now, with the Sun conjoined Mars in Pisces and in the fifth house, she can not only give herself to a role, she can dive into it. And she can dive into it in such a way that she becomes almost more of herself, without restraint, but still in the presence of mind to sort of feel herself right through the role. She may seem a little bit lost in a sea, with the what the Mideastern poets used to call divine drunkenness. The presence of Mars in this revolving conjunction with the Sun and Mercury shows that she puts herself into this kind of acting very energetically. It also means that she gets a rush or a charge of energy, which makes it an even stronger divine intoxication. And it shows this to be an exertion, where she exerts and gives herself, and she does so vigorously that in a way she gets filled with energy. Now all of these planets are opposite to Neptune, and Neptune in the planetary spectrum represents a divine, impersonal stranger. And again, it's in that house where one escapes oneself into a role. Now, Neptune disposits the fifth house planets, and Mercury disposits Neptune. So there is a mutual reception between Mercury and Neptune, and the fact that they are in a pretty strong opposition at the same time indicates that there's a real tracked way of behavior. The mutual reception represents a syndrome, and it represents a pattern that feeds on itself and rises higher and higher or lower and lower, depending on whether it's a tailspin or whether it's an upliftment. It also represents a kind of confusion. It represents a state of being lost. It's sort of like being in the woods following trail markers, but the trail markers, instead of leading one out, mislead one and take you deeper into confusion. It's that kind of a thing. The Mars opposite Neptune is again even more of the same business of divine intoxication. Now this leads a person to believe that a person has powers which they really don't have. And the Sun conjunct Neptune, Sun opposite Neptune indicates a kind of psycho-spiritual identity crisis. A person doesn't know who one is and what one may be, and you might think you might think one way, and it turns out to be just the opposite. That's the way it works with Sun opposite oppositions. Now, since Neptune is a full spectrum planet, supposedly the astrologer's planet that can be anything and all things, anything one wanted to be, if a person starts getting those feelings and they're associated with self-consciousness and they're associated with the energy of Mars, a person begins to believe they are omnipotent. After all, dramas are the way that the mysteries have always been celebrated. By living in a divine role outside of yourself, you begin to see your divine nature. And Neptune is the planet of divinity, so all of this has a whole feeling or a tinging of divinity. And because it's an otherworldly planet, it has the certitude of truth to it. Now, because of this, actresses and actors get into that otherworld kind of glory. However, because it is not real in the way that history is real, it's real in the way that the spiritual worlds are real, there's an element of illusion about it, because they are simulating or only indirectly experiencing something beyond their normal personal state. So there's illusion. And when something seems to be true and gets proven to not be true, the person who acted on the appearance of truth is then seen as someone who is treacherous and unreliable. This is why actors and actresses were considered, you can't trust them because they can act this way and they can act that way. It happens that way if you're involved with in a relationship with this kind of person. They seem to be being one way, but they really aren't. So we can see then on one hand, actors and actresses were seen as divinely touched, and they were seen as magicians. And when they were seen that way, it wasn't all just false glamour. There was something really to it. On the other hand, they're seen as shifty and dishonest and unreliable, even when their intentions are honorable and they do what they do in good faith. In this we can see that Elizabeth Taylor is almost a living representation or an epitome of acting and the world's view of acting. She's not, nowadays she's sort of passé, but the people were not very neutral about her. Now let's try to see how it feels from inside of her. Whether it is a role personalized or whether it is an impersonal role, it's still a role. All of us can be anything. The potential to be anything is in all of us. And over the course of many rebirths, we have been many things. Ultimately, in our divine being, we can be all things, and we can be in all things, but we really are not them. In our ultimate spiritual nature, we transcend, and we are beyond thinghood. So Elizabeth Taylor, when she plays a role, she may play it full bore and seem even to herself to be that role, but ultimately she's not. She's still Elizabeth Taylor. If she's not the role, who is she? If we are not the personality that we see, that we are living out now, who are we? These are serious questions. The question that has asking this kind of question has caused a lot of people to drop their identification with the personality. And when they drop the identification with the personality, they discover who they really are. And they can see in their innermost being what they are as spiritual beings. Now, there are similarities between these two questions, and there are differences. The one question being, if Elizabeth Taylor is not the role, who is she? And the other question being, if we are not our personalities, who are we? Now, through both of these questions, we can come to know the individual, to know the self, who we are in our spiritual being. And in both, in the personality or in the role, we can be lost to our true identity. So both are ways of finding, both are ways of losing. So you see, this whole opposition is a perfect expression of that kind of thing. There is a difference, and the chief difference is that the personality is an emanation from the self. And for the most part, it is a history of our experience in past personalities. They're linked together. And so our personalities are divine emanations. Whereas the role is much more figmentary. And in modern drama, often the role doesn't have any redeeming qualities about it. So when you lose yourself into a role and you identify with that role, you're identifying with something that is very figmentary. And if you take a whole life, this is somebody from a teenage on that has been playing role after role of all different types. You can see the problems that come up with this. This gives us a little bit of an idea of what it's like of vicarious living in living through various roles. You have to bring the role to life. And that involves commitment, and it involves sincerity. Now, when you live vicariously in the role, you learn about yourself, and you learn about the character in the role, and you learn a lot of little things along the way. And when you do that, and you see yourself in many different forms, it loosens your attachment to your personality. And when you're loosened, you can experience divinity. And you can experience that which is present through all those different roles. This is the high purpose of acting that we spoke about earlier. However, the uplifted state that comes from experiencing that doesn't last. And then what does one do? Now, if the person is already confused about identity, especially in the personality, and is somebody who lives in a make-believe world of acting, they're in a tough place, especially in the kind of things that Elizabeth Taylor did, because she also lived in a world that was full of false glamour. It's not difficult to become intoxicated when people are not wanting to live their own lives and they're projecting onto the glamour of your life as a star. And so when you're not up from that rush of enthusiasm of playing the role that is indicated by the Mars part of all of this, you want to get back up again. This is something that all performers have, because when they're, especially if it's live performance, rock musicians, whether they are inclined toward drugs or not, often move to drugs, because when they're performing and everybody is sending them their love, they can reach very much further into their talents, and they can do things they couldn't do otherwise. And then they come down and they're not content with their personal state. The personal state seems boring, so what they do is take drugs and alcohol and things like that to try and lift themselves back up. It's illusion, but they're already screwed up by illusion in the first place, because they don't know what's true or what's not true. That's how, you know. I'm sure you've all heard it already, where people say, well, there's not much difference between a real high and a drug high. And if your whole life is lived in, you could call acting falsity. In fact, in some religions, they do call it falsity, because it isn't history. It isn't day-to-day things. And so it's easy to see in the desire to want to reach that higher state why one can become addicted. And Neptune is the planet of addiction. And it's easy to lie to yourself that you're not addicted. That's what the Mercury-Neptune does. It's lying. It's not like telling somebody a lie, no, I didn't cheat. It's like it's a lie saying, no, this isn't really true about me. Now, these are some of the difficulties that come out of vicarious living in acting, and they can go all the way down to drugs. Now, this is somebody, as we mentioned earlier, who has acted her entire life. She was an adolescent when she did National Velvet, and she acted regularly all the way until in her 60s. Now, it's difficult to determine which is more dangerous, stage acting or screen acting. In stage acting, you live more in the moment, and you're living in it, and you're not in a set that's there for just a few minutes and then you go off set and it's over. And on stage, there's an additional boost because you have a live audience, and a live audience can put you up in a big hurry. In the movies or in TV, it's clearly phony, but there's much more hype, and the audience is much more broad, and there's much more of the star glamour kinds of things. Millions of people are going to the movie or watching you on television, and they're projecting things from their own lives onto you. And it's very difficult to get away from that. In a way, she's responsible for all of her dalliances and her unfaithfulness in marriage, because a lot of the people wanted to live through her. You know, they wanted to see her with Eddie Fisher, and then they wanted to see her with Richard Burton, even though it meant an obvious, open, adulterous relationship. And so that all gets projected on her. That happened with Richard Nixon. I am thoroughly convinced that when Richard Nixon got phlebitis, when the blood coagulated in his legs, it was because of hatred that was projected on him, and he accepted it, and it froze his blood, and it you know, that's not to say, you know, that was an act of unconscious black magic of humanity projecting on one man. Now, one wants to escape the fans, but at the same time, one is flattered by them. And you get addicted to the adoration of the fans in the same way that you get addicted to being high and playing the role. Moreover, one feels a responsibility to one's fans. And in that, one will live out the lie for the sake of the fans. So this is another act of, another type of vicarious living that comes out of all of these things. Some roles have more potential for being dangerous for vicarious living. And probably the most dangerous and the most famous role for her was Cleopatra. And Cleopatra was considered the most beautiful, or certainly the most charming and captivating woman of the ancient world. She was the consort of emperors, and she captivated them. And so it was this role that she openly, before the whole world, turned away from her own husband and went away with Richard Burton. And it was from this role on that she went in the direction of alcohol and pills and things like that. So this was a dangerous role for her to play that kind of a person. And this brings us to another major pattern of vicarious living, which isn't quite vicarious living, but similar to it. And that is that she was married 8 times to 7 different husbands. Now, marriage isn't exactly like vicarious living, but it has vicarious aspects to it. Now, with Libra on the ascendant, she has a marrying personality, a personality which accommodates and compensates for other people. Now, you can say that she's doing what she wants to do, but she can't do it without somebody else. So she is at least living for someone else, if not through someone else. There's a kind of vicariousness to it. So this chart is riddled with that kind of business. The very strong life ruler of the ascendant, Venus, is in the 7th house, which is abstractly ruled by Venus. The natural character of the 7th house is responsiveness. In the 7th house, one does not initiate, one reacts, or one responds, even though there might be some kind of indirect initiation. But the 7th house is kind of funny. It's like that pseudo-Chinese maxim, which I don't think the Chinese ever developed, but it's put in that kind of tone, like those old Confucius kind of jokes. And this is the statement that a man chases a woman until she catches him, meaning to say that there is that indirect action on the part of the woman in mating with a man. But that kind of thing cannot really be done with regard to anyone unless there is someone there to be a correspondent to it. Now with Venus and Uranus in Aries, she's more likely to be proactive than most. But even at that, she can't practice her lover's wiles without a lover. So to be herself, she still needs someone else. Again, this is not quite perfectly vicarious, but there's enough dependence and enough escape in living to or through or for another so that it has some of the same perils of vicarious acting. A lot of women find themselves in a position in life that they've lived for their husband, and suddenly their husband dies of a heart attack in the 50s, and they don't know who they are anymore because everything they've done has been living, has been in that vicarious way for the sake of the other. And there hasn't been a coetaneous development of self for the sake of self. What happens in a chart like Elizabeth Taylor, what happens when the bloom of romance has faded or is wilting away? Then a person is in a place that's similar to when the show is over and the uplifting audience is gone and you're left to yourself alone. Now Mars is the ruler of the 7th and it's in the 5th, so she could pour her love and her energy and everything else into her children. And that would be a less vicarious way, though parents seem to be able to make that a vicarious activity also. But what happened was she had her children at a time when there were always more and better roles coming up for herself. Now it's a very ironic thing that her children were drawn into this vicarious living in that they were brought up more by nannies than they were brought up by their own mother. And she had children, but the children were more familiar with others than they were with her, at least until they got to be adults, and she was not so busy with acting at that time. When she got beyond the years of romance, and she was able to, she turned her living for others into generosity. She involved herself with charity, and that too is indicated by Uranus and Venus giving themselves to Jupiter, which is in the 11th, which is an impersonal kind of charity. Uranus and Venus is a classic for falling in love. It's every bit as strong and it's every bit as sudden as Mars conjoined Venus. However, there is a celestial quality. With Mars and Venus, it was like we were made for each other biochemically, but with Uranus and Venus, it's like we were made for each other in heaven. And so there is, in Uranus and Venus, there is the certitude of divinity in falling in love. Now, if a person is not keenly self-aware and is not self-watching, it can be as misleading as playing a role. Instead of losing oneself to a role, one abrogates one's responsibility to oneself to the spell of being in love. One is dodging oneself in a vicarious seeking of the object, or seeking or giving to the object of love. So like falling in love is a beautiful thing, but it isn't all beautiful if you allow it to become a psychological syndrome. Not only does Uranus give the surety of truth, it has the feeling of permanence. It has the feeling of eternity. All the stations of Uranus are in fixed signs. Its rulership, its exaltation, its detriment and fall are all fixed signs. It's a spiritual planet with instantaneous existence, or intuition comes instantaneously and you know that something is true. As a personal planet, the Uranian temperament tends to cling to the moment of truth forever, never expanding on it, never having new intuitions. The personal side tends to cling in that way. With Uranus and Venus, romance can have these same qualities. When the romance truly fades because it isn't fed by inspiration all the time, some people try to rev it up and make it work. This is one of the weaknesses of Uranus and Venus. And in Elizabeth Taylor, this tendency of trying to make being in love, continue to be being in love, is much magnified. And it's given another character of vicariousness. And that is, the Venus and Uranus are both square to Pluto. And as we saw earlier, Venus-Pluto combinations are obsessions. They never let go. She never ever really gave up on Richard Burton. The Venus-Pluto part indicates something else in this horoscope, and it's another kind of vicariousness. Venus in affliction with either Saturn or Pluto leads to a vicariousness in voyeurism. So with Pluto in the 10th house, we can see that she wants to live through the power of somebody who's prominent, who is distinguished, who is eminent in the world. Of all of her husbands, only the last one, the construction worker, was not a person of power or a person of fame or something like that. Now, at this point, it would be appropriate to try to understand, relative to all of these things, her insatiable fondness for jewelry, because it is tied in, but I'd have to go into too many things to want to do that. So this gives you a chance to synthesize and tell me what you think of why she was so attracted to jewelry. There are plenty of other things to synthesize in here, and there's, it's great fun doing this. You can spend hours and hours, and that's all I have to offer, and after 10 years, it's probably enough. And what's going to happen is next year, I think I'm going to do only 2 classes, and they will alternate on Thursday nights. One class is going to be a very simple introduction to mysticism. And it'll probably run for the rest of my life. And it'll go back and forth between very, very elementary topics taken as fundamentally as they can be taken, and then and sometimes it'll be very deep things. I'll go off into a sub-series on different kinds of things. The other class is going to be, I'm going to redo one more time the class on aspects and the astrological aspects. And probably I'm going to beef it up. In fact, after every major section, I'm going to give examples from the lives of famous people, and that way make it more relevant to everyday living. And that's that.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for coming and bringing. He's quite strong and assured in himself, isn't he?